Welcome back, everyone. Today, we're continuing to talk about the command of Christ, honor your parents. This is part 3 in a 4-part series. Gabe, do you want to go ahead and start us out?
So the verse that our command comes from is Matthew chapter 15, verse 4, which says, "For God commanded, saying, Honor thy father and mother, and he that curseth father or mother, let him die the death." And in our previous episodes and in this episode, we're going to be focusing on this command, honor father and mother. And we're going to look at practically how do you honor your parents. But before we do, I want to take a moment to make a note to parents, because one thing that I noticed, Nate, as in looking in Ephesians 6, which also has the command to honor parents in Ephesians chapter 6, verse 2. It says, honor thy father and thy mother, which is the first commandment with a promise. You know, you'll notice if you look in Ephesians 5 and 6, where there's a lot of instructions towards husbands and wives and parents and children and masters and servants, that the way the flow of the passage goes is that the Lord gives instruction first to the one under authority, but then he gives instruction to the one in authority. Mm-hmm. So he gives instruction to the wives, but then he gives instruction to the husbands. He gives instruction to the children, but then he gives instruction to the fathers. And then he gives instruction to the servants, but then he gives instruction to the masters. And I think it's just important to realize that if you're in a position of authority, being in authority is a privilege, but it's an incredible weighty responsibility that we have an accountability before God for. And I think of even in Ephesians 6, where it says, children, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right. It goes on and says, honor thy father and mother, which is the first commandment with a promise, that it may be well with thee, and thou mayest live long on the earth. So that's the command to the children, right? But then it says to the parents, and ye fathers, specifically to the fathers, it says, and ye fathers, provoke not your children to wrath, but bring them up in the nurture and admonition of the Lord. There's a very similar verse directed at fathers in Colossians 3:21 that says, fathers, provoke not your children to anger, lest they be discouraged. And it's just important to realize that being in authority is a weighty responsibility. And there's a number of different reasons for that. Part of it is because we're accountable before God for how we lead. And that's a serious thing. But I think also an aspect of it that is both a privilege and a weighty responsibility is that for parents, and specifically for fathers, what I've seen, Nate, is I've worked with a lot of young people, is a lot of young people get their early views of who God is from their parents.
That's right.
And specifically from their father. So sometimes if their father was distant and not involved in their life, they wrongly view God in that same way.
That's right.
Or sometimes if the father was overbearing and controlling, they actually view God to be wrongly, to be that same way. And so as a parent, and specifically as a father, it's a weighty responsibility because in some ways, and you are, like a father, a parent is supposed to be a channel of the love and the life of the Lord to his children. But just to realize the responsibility and accountability that comes that in the children's early days, they may get part of their view of God from the parent. And so I guess I just want to highlight that point that it's important to realize we're going to direct most of this episode towards the need for children to honor parents, but just to realize for parents, and really whether you're a parent or an employer or in any area of authority, it's a weighty responsibility that we would be an accurate representation of Christ to those under our authority.
It really is. And Gabe, if you think about it this way, okay, we're talking about children honoring their parents. Well, you have to ask the question, how does a child learn to honor their parents? It's actually through the actions of their parents. It's actually through the training of their parents. So if their parents say one thing and do another, there's going to be conflict. Now, granted, I've never met a perfect set of parents. And so really honoring your parents goes with, in any situation as we honor the Lord. And in fact, I guess I want to point out, Gabe, specifically, the phrase here, I don't know if we caught this or not, but it says, children, obey your parents, how? In the Lord, or as to the Lord. And so whether it's obedience as a child to the parents, or whether it's really honoring your parents, it's both is to be done as to the Lord.
And I think too with that, that's so good because it's like we're to honor our parents as to the Lord, right? It says, children, obey your parents in the Lord. And so really, any way that we honor, obey our parents, the only that we should do it when we can do it in the Lord. Obviously, if our parents asked us to do something that contradicted God's
Correct.
word, we couldn't do that in the Lord, and
That's
so we
right.
couldn't do that, like we talked about in the previous episode. But if we can do it in the Lord, then God wants that. I also think you brought out a really profound point in this, in talking about the parents, is that I think, Nate, that it's not so much that the parent needs to demand honor from the children. The call, I think, of the parent is to act and live and walk before God in an honorable way. And the child will see that, and there will be respect and the honor that comes as a result of that. Certainly for very young children, there's a training and a teaching of children needing to obey their parents and honor them in the proper way. When a child's very young, there has to be that training and that teaching. But if a parent is teaching their children to honor them, but then they don't act in an honorable way, like, that's a serious thing for the parent to do,
serious,
right?
yes.
And so now that doesn't excuse us from honoring, even if the parent is making mistakes and messing up, we still need to honor them. That doesn't. This is not an excuse to the person to us from honoring. But I think it's an important word for the parent that one of the greatest ways to encourage your children in honoring you is living and walking in an honorable way.
Yes, and Gabe, as we're talking about this phrase, in the Lord, so we're talking about children, obey your parents in the Lord, and I think the same applies to honoring them in the Lord as we would the Lord. I think as we're talking about practical things here, how do we honor our parents in a very practical way? I think the very first step in honoring our parents is honoring God. We've talked about this in past episodes, but realizing God has put them in our life for a reason, that it's God's hand that's involved, that it's God that's using them. 3 John chapter 1, chapter 1, yes, starting in verse 2 says, "Beloved, I wish above all things," notice the priority that's placed on this, "I wish above all things that thou mayest prosper and be in health, even as thy soul prospereth." And I think of just that connection, Gabe, with the command honoring our parents, is that it may be well with you and that you may live long upon the earth. And you almost kind of see a little bit of that here. But then it says in verse 3, "For I rejoiced greatly when the brethren came and testified of the truth that is in thee, even as thou walkest in the truth." And then we have this classic verse here in 3 John chapter 1, verse 4. "I have no greater joy than to hear that my children walk in the truth." And the point that I'm making here is the basis for all parental honor is honoring God. It's walking in the truth. It's living in a way that pleases Jesus. And that as I do that, I will be walking in a way that honors my parents.
That's so good. And I think, too, that it's good to see, too, that actually because the way God set up life to work was for us to honor our parents, that it's actually a foolish and even sometimes dangerous thing to dishonor our parents.
It is.
I think about what it says in let's look at Proverbs 10, chapter 1. Proverbs chapter 10, verse 1. It says, "The Proverbs of Solomon, a wise son maketh a glad father, but a foolish son is the heaviness of his mother." And I'll just say this, Nate, in working with a lot of families and different things, the greatest grief in life that a parent has is when their children doesn't walk in truth. But when children do walk in truth, just what a joy that brings. But it's also an exhortation to us to walk towards honoring our parents. And actually, it's a foolish thing to disregard our parents and their counsel. And I even think of a story from when I was much, much younger. Okay, so this was when I would still been in the children category, and I don't remember how old I was, but I was young. And I'd gone with my dad and my two brothers, and we were going to go swimming and at this lake. And I hadn't done a lot of swimming before. I didn't really know how to swim, so we were going to go play in the water, I should probably say. My dad is a great swimmer, but I didn't really know how to swim that well. And so we were going to play in kind of the more shallow area of the water there. And I believe my dad had told us, okay, here's the boundary, don't go past this, because he knew when the lake got deeper. And so he said to stay in the shallow areas. And he was he was going to be there kind of watching swimming and stuff, and we were to stay in the shallow areas. So we were having fun, splashing around and whatever. But then I kind of thought, it'd be fun to go out a little deeper, and so I walked a little past the boundary, and it seemed fine. Nothing happened. I wasn't like I drowned or anything. I thought, this is fine. And so I went a little further, and it was still okay. And I went a little further, and it was still okay. In my mind, in my childish mind, I thought it won't be a problem, because if it gets too deep, I can just turn and walk back. My feet are on the bottom of the lake. Now, that's what I thought. It doesn't quite work that way, but that's what I thought. And so I started walking, but then all of a sudden, it got deeper, and the water went over my head, and I just remember that grip of terror, because I didn't know how to swim. And if our listeners have ever had that feeling where you're in the water and you're drowning, it's a horrible feeling.
It's horrible.
And it just gripped with fear. And I remember the water going over my head, and I couldn't swim. And I remember I got my feet on the bottom, and I pushed myself up, and I poked my head out, and I was like, Dad, help! And I went back under the water. Thankfully, my dad was close by, and he swam over, and he grabbed me and pulled me to safety. But one of the things I want to bring out, and I like the very simple illustration from when I was a child, but here's what I didn't see, was that actually the boundaries my dad had given me were not to limit my enjoyment. They were actually to protect me. Mm-hmm. And I think sometimes, like when there's different, especially for a child, when there's different boundaries and restrictions put in place, we can feel like, why are these things here? And these things are limiting my freedom. But actually, they're not so much what they're doing is they're put in place to protect us.
Yes. That
one of the reasons that God gives children parents is for their protection. And, parents love their children. And so that the boundaries given are for our good. Mm-hmm. And to disregard those things is actually foolish.
Yes, and I think you're right, because wisdom is understanding just that, Gabe, the purpose for why God has placed our parents in our life. And that's not just as a child, that's as an adult. Why are my parents still involved in my life as an adult, when I'm out on my own, making my own decisions? And that kind of plays into our next point here, Gabe, that we want to talk about in a very practical, hands-on way. How do we honor our parents? We can do that by listening to their counsel and their reproofs, especially as an adult, as there is the transition from a child to adult, where we're starting to make decisions on our own, we're starting to have responsibilities of our own, where there is still a need to listen to their counsel and reproofs. Look at Proverbs 13:1. It says, "A wise son heareth his father's instruction, but a scorner heareth not rebuke." Proverbs 23:22 says, "Hearken unto thy father that begat thee, and despise not thy mother," and here's the phrase, "when she is old." And so even as an adult, even when our parents grow older, and we're not so much directly under their supervision and direction, there is a part and a very important place in still listening to them. Not necessarily doing everything exactly the way they tell us, but it's more of from the standpoint of they've been around the corner more times than I have. They know many times what's beyond and that I can't see, and the wisdom and experience God has given them, it is honoring to go to them. Especially, Gabe, I've learned this personally. Whenever I come up against, or whenever I come to making big decisions, I have benefited so much from going to my mom and dad. Now, mind you, I'm married. I have a family of my own. I'm living in my own home. But yet I've benefited so much from going to them and seeking their counsel, asking, what would you do in this situation? And listening to that. And not only does that benefit me, but it honors them.
Well, and I think that's one of the neat things is it's like when you make that transition from where you're a child and, your parents have to tell you brush your teeth and make your bed and do all those things, and you're doing that to when you start to transition into adulthood and you're making some of your own decisions, you're learning, you're walking with God, you're listening to Him, you're in His Word, you're seeking His face. you're walking in that way. It's such an honoring thing, though, to still seek counsel from your parents and talk to them and just to honor them in that way. Because I think too, Nate, even the transition that happens when a person gets married, that the scripture says in Mark 10:7, for this cause shall a man leave his father and mother and cleave to his wife. It talks about the two becoming one flesh. And so there is this sense where when somebody gets married, that they leave their father and mother and they enter now into that relationship of marriage, and in many ways now establishing their own family, right? And the authority structure that comes with that. So there needs to be that leaving and that cleaving where it's like you've left father and mother to cleave to your spouse.
Right.
But the honor aspect of it is, even though you've started your own family, you're making, your own decisions and walking before the Lord as a family, there's still such a precious thing to keep that relationship with your parents strong, so that there's the counsel and there's the advice and there's the wisdom, and that their counsel still holds weight, that you still give that honor to them, even though now there's been that change in authority structure through the husband and wife now marrying.
Right.
There's still that you care about your parents, you honor. But what I love about that is now that honor is not, it's not done even out of like an obligatory obedience. It's out of, I value your counsel, holds weight with me, and I want to honor you. We're obviously commanded to honor.
Yes.
And that's one thing, is we're always commanded to honor.
We're always.
Right. And so that you never outgrow honoring.
You never outgrow honoring. And really, honestly, Gabe, the heart of obedience, I think in many ways, is a heart of honor. You can't truly obey without having the heart of honor behind it.
So even though there's changes in, as a person gets older, and there's the changes in the function and the different things, and there's the change in the authority structure when a person gets married, there's still a call to honor. And I think that's at the heart of this command: honor your father and mother. And I think, Nate, even looking at the specific command, you remember, for those that listened to the previous episodes, but the context of this command was that that the scribes and Pharisees had found a way that when their parents, it's seemingly elderly parents, or because it seems like this would be based on the context, it was actually speaking of adult children, and their parents are coming looking for help, and they're trying to find a way to not do it.
Exactly.
So this command to honor parents seems to be directed actually towards adult children.
Yes.
So we still walk in honor.
Yep, that's right. We still walk in honor. And in conclusion here with this episode, I think a few other areas quickly, Gabe, is like we're talking about, taking care of them when they have a need. Taking care of them when they are old, and really, what this is doing in many ways is it's rendering respect. It's rendering honor. In conclusion here, I'm just going to go ahead and read Romans 13, 7 through 8, because I think this would be a good stopping point for this episode. As we're talking about honoring and how do we do that, Romans 13, starting verse 7 says, render therefore to all their dues, tribute to whom tribute is due, custom to whom custom, fear to whom fear, and honor to whom honor. Owe no man anything but to love one another. And catch this. This is probably one of the most significant parts of this passage. For he that loveth another hath fulfilled the law. Now we know that in context with Romans 13, we're talking about governing authorities, but it also talks about all authority is given by God. And we're called, and part of that all authority is our parents. And part of honoring them is recognizing them. It's taking care of them. And really, Gabe, the baseline for all of this is a heart of love for the Lord, and is a heart of love for our parents. And as we as children, or even grown adults that still have parents, as our hearts are lined up with God's hearts, as we're listening, obeying Him, a natural outflow of that is going to be an attitude and a heart of honor that's going to be motivated through love. So that's about all the time we have on this episode. We really hope this has encouraged you, given you some practical tools of how you can honor your parents, and most importantly, seeing that you're seeing through this command of how much the Lord loves you, and how much of a blessing it is to be able to allow God to work this command through us in honoring our parents, and the blessings that come through fulfilling the command. God bless you, and we hope that you join us on our next episode.